welcome at FSR Talks, the very first of the year. All the school are with me, namely we are two, Chiara Canestrini, the digital fairy behind the screen, and I, to wish you the best possible year, maybe in spring or in summer, some happiness, if Mr. COVID-19 agrees. We are delighted this afternoon hosting Nicolas Petit, Nicolas Petit, if you prefer it in English. Nicolas is professor of competition law at the same European University Institute like me in Florence, but to be frank, we are not hosting Nicolas at all. We are hosting the book. You see it? Up. The book, 300 pages, published at Oxford University Press 3 months ago. 3 months for a book yesterday afternoon. And I'm very interesting by the approach. But before giving you my view on the approach, I will remember you the rules at FSR Talks. I will give the floor 15 minutes to Nicolas to tell what he wants, including his biography. It is his problem, not mine. After these 15 minutes, I will give immediately the floor to Professor Brousseau, the holder of the chair Governance and Regulation at Paris Dauphine University, to challenge Nicolas, because we are not there to applaud. We will applaud, but at the end, what we want is to challenge, to get more from his brain or from his book. And Nicolas will get 3 minutes to answer Eric. If needed, I will challenge my turn, Nicolas, 3 minutes. He will have 3 minutes to answer. And then Q&A with the audience. Q&A with the audience, so you have to ask your question in the Q&A box, not in the chat box. In the chat box, it is to speak openly. Questions only in the Q&A. Now, I am back to the book. What do I like into the book? There is 2 types of interesting books, the interesting and the very interesting. This one is very interesting. Why? But the topic is not bad. Big tech and the digital economy, also the digital society, digital politics, even digital humans. Many of you in the audience are digital native, like Chiara Canestrini. All of this, the big tech, smells monopoly. They make fortune. They have margin truly incredible. Their stock value is hard to remember. Apple alone today is worth 2,200 billion US dollar. 2,200 a single company. They have monopoly power. Okay, maybe, but how do you explain this? Do they cheat? Do they abuse? Or do they exploit positive economic forces? And what are these positive economic forces able to create such monopolies? Second, do they compete? At least among them, Apple and Google are not kissing every morning, even not every Sunday afternoon. They compete. So strange monopoly competing. Third, do they innovate? They innovate. New products, new services. So strange monopolies competing, innovating, exploiting positive economic forces. If there are monopolies, they are of a new kind. Second part of the book, can society get better from the monopolies? Do we have Nicolas is professor of competition law. So do we have competition policy tools to get better? To get better, not only to get revenge, because they are so important animals, big tech, that what is interesting is to get better. For example, does it make sense to break them up? Does it make sense to impede them to acquire startups or unicorns? Should we cap their pricing? And beyond competition tools, there is obvious harms that have to be addressed differently. For example, protection of privacy. For example, non-dissemination of fake news. For example, not supporting hate speeches. Now we have to get used that every 4 years we will get a mob invading Capitol and killing 5 people in Washington, D.C. I do not tell more. I would love having written the book. I'm unable to, but Nicolas did. Nicolas, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Jean-Michel, for the very kind words and introduction. And thanks to Eric for accepting to discuss the book with me today. So I'm going to share my screen immediately. Right, I'm sure you can see the slides now. All right, there we go. So I want to say a word about the motivation behind the book, and then I'll focus on the last chapter in the interest of making this of a broader acceptance and understanding to the audience. So I started to write this book maybe 3.5 years ago, and I spent some time in the Silicon Valley. And at the time, I started to witness a lot of interest in the United States about this phenomenon that we today refer to as big tech. And this phenomenon really led a lot of people, not lawyers like me, but economists and political scientists, to start produce papers and briefs and policy notes and even books about one major disease that seems to, or was said to plague the American economy and society, namely monopolies. And so since then, we've been really an outburst of books about monopolies, and in particular tech monopolies, to the point that it probably has become a literary genre, to use a French word, with books called Goliath, Break Him Up, and Monopolies Suck. And an interesting feature about these books, as I hinted before, is that most of them tend to say that the large tech company that we know as GAFAM or FANGs occupy a prominent place in the discussion of monopolies. These writers tend to suggest that lots of problems today witnessed in American society, like low wages or health insurance problems or the corruption of the electoral system, these are not my words, by the way, owe to monopoly structures and monopoly behavior, owe to the large size of business corporations, and in particular, the large size of these tech companies. And so this has led to a massive advocacy exercise by various types of groups to call for antitrust policy, which is an old American tradition dating back from the late 19th century, to revive and reinvigorate its enforcement, and calls to break up these companies in multiple units, as was done with companies like AT&T, and as was tried against companies like Microsoft more recently, if 20 years is anything recent. And so what's interesting about these calls is that even though they're Americans, in the world we live in, with the globalization not only of trade but of ideas, these arguments have spilled over to Europe, which has been to some extent very prone to look into this, probably more agile in terms of the policy and regulatory thinking, maybe less also less hampered by ideological polarization as happens in the United States. And we've seen a lot of people in Europe talk about these very American concerns, and so the root reason being monopolies. And so that really triggered my interest, and I actually wrote a book to think about this, and to think about whether these big tech firms were really the cause of all these problems. And to be a little more accurate, the question was, is the big tech industry one that is characterized by a monopoly power, leading to all sorts of problems, including new problems caused by these large market positions? And so I really looked into that in the book, and in particular in chapter 6. So in chapter 6 of the book, what I'm trying to address and why it matters is the question whether the novel harms often discussed in relation to big tech, like fake news, hate speech, privacy losses, or even incitement to violence, whether these harms should be dealt with under competition policy, economic regulation on the one hand, or should they be addressed by another type of non-economic regulation? And I'm sure a lot of people in the audience know that the way we do public policy in Europe and also in the United States operates on the basis of a division of labor between economic regulation, antitrust on the one hand, and non-economic regulation, non-antitrust, of course, on the other hand. There's a sort of division of labor. There's this old idea, one target, one tool, the Tinbergen principle. And you need to use the dedicated instruments to achieve, a certain goal. And so the question is, should we deal with privacy losses or fake news with the anti-monopoly instrument that we have, be they either antitrust prohibitions or some sort of economic market power regulation, as we see in the energy industries or in the telecoms industries, for instance? Or is that something completely different? So the Americans and the writers of the books that I showed have their views. They say this is for antitrust. Antitrust is a broad instrument that is supposed to address these issues as well. And my assumption here is that that's not the case. Antitrust is essentially interested in dealing with market power, which is a very well understood economic issue for decades. Okay, so what I do in the book is, in chapter 6, is I say, well, there's a simple procedure to know with which instruments. So if you have a problem, and if you want to, so if you have an idea that you need a solution, you first start to diagnose the problem. And so the question has to be, is this a market power or a monopoly power problem or not a monopoly problem? Okay, and there's a simple way to address the question. You can take one type of harm, say privacy losses, and you ask yourself 3 simple questions. Is the privacy loss caused by a monopoly, or might it exist under competition? Second question, if monopoly power is not the sole cause of privacy losses, would harm to privacy be lower under competition? And third question, if privacy losses are lower under competition, can we be confident that enforcing competition will not create other externalities, other problems? Okay, if the answer to the 3 questions leans more towards the no, well, then you need non-economic regulation, and you should not apply antitrust or market power regulation. If the answer is yes, of course, you might want to try to introduce competition to Google, Facebook, and other companies, and resolve the problems with that tool. Okay, so let me run you through a concrete example of that. So let's look at privacy harms, privacy losses. So several tech giants use business models adverse to privacy. Google, Facebook, and perhaps to a lesser extent Microsoft and Amazon, that generate substantial revenue by selling targeted advertisements to suppliers upstream, companies like Coca-Cola, Colgate, whatever. Targeted advertisement reduces privacy in more than one way. This requires extraction of personal data. Targeted ads interfere with every user's ability to choose alone and make decisions. And with targeted advertisements, you never really enjoy seclusion from the solitude that you might be willing to get when you're online. So with this background, the first question in the procedure is, are privacy harms caused by monopoly, or are they or not? And one very intuitively attractive way to think about that is to imagine a breakup of Google. between various companies like Google, Moogle, Zoogle, and Foogle, for instance. And the question that you have to ask yourself is whether this breakup, which would lead to more direct competition between the various Zoogles, would this lead to less privacy law? Would this lead to more privacy compliance? Would this lead to less privacy harms? And what will happen is fairly simple. I mean, I developed that in the book, but I explained that if you increase competition between these various companies, assuming they keep the same business model, what's going to happen is that the price of targeted advertisement to suppliers is going to decrease, the demand for targeted advertisement by suppliers is going to increase, and what's going to happen is that at the end of the line, there will be more targeted ads and less privacy to users. You can carry on, with the same and the two other questions and think about, okay, but if there was competition, would there be a lower equilibrium of data extraction by the platforms? So if you look at the aggregate privacy extraction in a competitive market of Google, Moogle, Foogle, and Zoogle, would there be less data extraction? This is an empirical question. A lot of people in the policymaking structure, they seem to believe that the answer to that is yes, because there would be the emergence of privacy-friendly business models. The Zoogle and Foogle might not be based on the same business model. But this is very much of an empirical question, and the anecdotal evidence that we see today that the horizontal competitors to Facebook and Google, for instance, Amazon, which is currently making a killing in the ads markets, is basically also extracting personal data in the service of its retail platform. So last but not least, the third question is, can we be confident that if we introduce that competition to Google in targeted in search, for instance, can you be confident that this will not create other externalities? And again, you might create more privacy, but that might lead to other externalities, meaning people spending more time online, people being more addicted to life in digital spaces, addiction and things of this kind, which are extremely well documented in other fields of social science. So competition doesn't seem to be the bulletproof solution to the problem that we are facing, and as a result, competition enforcement and market power regulation do not seem really to be the silver bullets. So in the book, I talk about fake news. I run the same procedure. It's way more sophisticated than everything I can say here. So if people are interested, I'm happy to not send the book. It's quite expensive. It's been priced by a monopolist, or Oxford University Press. I'm just kidding here. I didn't have a choice on the price actually of the book. So if you're unhappy with it, I have to decline liability for that. But you can send me a line and I'll be happy to correspond with you. Now, the hard question is, if we are not in the basket of competition enforcement or economic regulation, the hard question really is, what model of regulation do we want to use to address fake news, privacy harms, and hateful content? And there's many options here. We can use consumer protection type for privacy. We can use retail distribution regulation for business models like Amazon, but it doesn't seem to carry much weight in the policymaking structure these days. And one thing that a lot of people do not really appreciate, and they only appreciate in my field at least, is that there's very little demand from other professionals in other fields of policymaking, like labor policy or labor law or consumer protection policy, for antitrust and market power regulation to step in. When I talk to people working in labor law, they often tell me, antitrust has nothing to do here. Leave us alone. Okay, so one key question for political economists in the future will be to think as to why there has been so much push in my field, antitrust, to tackle these novel harms. Okay, I have 1 minute, so I want to close with that last slide. The book is more generally variation around the theme of whether the big tech firms are monopolies, as Jean-Michel kindly said in his introduction. And I think, understanding is there's a lot of heterogeneity, and you can certainly not consider conclusively that each of these big tech firms is a monopolist. That's what I think I tried to convey in the book. Now, the recent events that we are witnessing tell us that there is indeed signs of increased competition in tech markets. Think about the exodus of WhatsApp users to Signal and Telegram in the past days due to a privacy policy miscommunication change by Facebook. Or think about the exodus of Twitter users to Parler following the Trump ban, right? All these users are fleeing, overcoming switching costs and going to differentiated product solutions. The hard question for people from my community and regulators is the following. Can we say confidently that the exodus of people from WhatsApp to Signal and Telegram is good competition? And can we say that the exodus of Twitter users to Parler following the Trump ban is bad competition? I don't think any competition agency wants to bring an answer to that hard question. And that's why I think regulation is badly needed. Thank you for your attention.
Many thanks, Nicolas. And now we jump with no transition to EricBrousseau, holder of the chair Governance and Regulation at Paris Dauphine University, to challenge Nicolas. Eric, are you ready to challenge?
Yes.
Please, go.
How long do I have? 5 minutes?
5 minutes, being 3 plus 2.
So okay, so first I like very much the book, but I will stop there for the positive comments for the sake of time. I think the book is very interesting and very stimulating. And in fact, the way you introduce your book in this talk is a bit misleading, I guess, for the audience, because most of the book is about the discussion of what is the economic model of the big tech firms, and you provide a very convincing demonstration of the traditional approach of the analysis of the business models of those firms, and also of the traditional approach of the regulation of the antitrust regulation of those firms, because basically either they are based on market structure or arm to customers in terms of rent extraction, when it's based on a static approach to competition, and even when the antitrust policy is based on a more dynamic approach to competition, which is basically a competition for the markets. It assumes that innovators get a rent and then are imitated, and then the rent erode, which result into a hand-off approach of competition policy. You basically demonstrate that the specificities of the platforms, big tech firms, that you qualify as Moligopoly firms in your book, is wrong, because those firms rely on a very specific business model that combine the fact that they are organized in ecosystems. They are based on platform effects and on network effects, and also you insist on the idea that they are all relying on AI, which is a combination of access to fine-grained data and the use of data science to use this information to enhance user experience and address the demand. And the combination of all those effects result into a capability to control the development of the market. and then the hands-off approach of regulation is of competition regulation is wrong, because it doesn't address the fact that those firms, those ecosystems, those oligopoles are able to control innovation, the pace of innovation, entry, etc., etc. And also, it doesn't address well, the other approach doesn't address well the problem, because those firms are by design providing value added to the consumer, to the users, and they are not harming so strongly the users. So the question, in fact, in a sense, is that those firms, they are not harming the users directly, because the users are happy with the service, most of the service provided, which are partly free. They are not all depending on the same business model, but if you take social networks, for instance, it's obvious that the service is provided for free. It's not costly for the users, but it's for free.
Time is ending.
Oh yes, already. So
you have only 1 minute left.
Okay. So the question is that in terms of public policy and antitrust policy, the question is that the harm is often upon the potential new entrants, potential competitors, because those large firms are able to control the evolution of the market. And the second point is that, as I fully agree with your approach of public policy, which basically develops the idea that antitrust is not the good policy tools to manage, let's say, societal or collective externalities. One of the claims of those platforms is that they have incentives and the capability also to manage the negative externalities, and the examples is a recent discussion on social network and this, let's say, the kind of self-regulation of social networks. So we can discuss the details, but about the illegitimate contents. But the question is also that the competition among the oligopoles can prevent them to take the right ethical action, the right action. And so the question is how to decide and when to decide to manage those negative and externalities, and how. So because you just mentioned that the traditional
game over, Eric.
Okay.
Game over. So, Nicolas, you know what to answer, I assume. What do you answer to Eric?
Yeah, no, that's so Eric closed with, he was very kind first to recall the work that goes before chapter 6 that I dealt with today, and to explain what I tried to do in the book. And it was a very clear and comprehensive and honest description of what I do. So I really appreciate that. Now, the question that you touch upon at the end is whether competition, or too much excessive competition to some extent, might lead these firms to be in this sort of rat race for attention, and keep people like Donald Trump, or violent content that keeps the people on the platform on them. And so if this is the natural incentive, and I agree, I would say that a natural incentive under competition for these firms is to keep eyeballs on the platform, and to that end, content like Trump tweets is very good, right? So I think the rational behavior of a platform would be to show, not to censor, okay? And so then the hard question for us is, so why did they censor Trump, right? If the incentive is by design to promote that. And there's a few, I think there's a few explanations here. which I believe owe to the political economy landscape. I think they are the most compelling ones. The first one being that the Biden administration is coming in, so they want to show, sign that they're good citizens and they support the administration. The other one is that regulation is coming, and they understand that, and so they want to say, hey, look, we, as you said, Eric, we can self-regulate to some extent. The problem is, by doing that, by self-regulating, they also show the power they have, right? And so they also give credence for more regulation, right? So in a way, damned if they let Trump on the platform because they're inciting violence, but damned if they remove Trump from the platform because, oh, look, the power they have, they can shut down the president of the United States. It was an impossible situation for them. And so that, I think, tells us that some sort of regulation of content, incitement to violence, hate speech, is necessary on these platforms. And so to completely address your question, so non-competition regulation is needed to deal with content. That's my answer. And certainly, and I would say more competition enforcement is also needed, because I find it a bit weird that the users that disagree with what Twitter did do not have a home on social networks, that they have to go to another platform. I mean, I don't really like the idea that the other platform is going to be shut down also by Amazon and others. So I say more regulation, more competition enforcement.
Okay, Nicolas. First question from me. We do not have much big companies in big tech in the EU. Is it because we are very smart, so we are preventing to be abused by such powerful companies? Or is it that Europeans do not like companies changing the world, and so we have no companies changing the world in the EU, and they are the US changing the world we live in? How do you see this issue?
Okay. Yeah, that's a $1 billion question, really.
That's fine.
Yeah, that's fine. That's okay. Okay, it seems to me that, okay, first, I don't believe in the idea that anti-competitive behavior by the established players explains that there's no European GAFA. I think there's lots of structural, cultural, regulatory factors that explain way more the absence of a European GAFA than anti-competitive behavior from Google, Facebook, and others. And these have to do with, so the cultural factors is that probably Europeans are more risk averse, they are less entrepreneurial. Their educational factors is we don't have, the sort of large, so we have very good universities, but they are more fragmented than they are in the United States. The internal market is not finished. And, whatever we say, it's really hard for a company to operate transnationally in Europe today, and all the more for a startup. So I think there's lots of, and the funny thing is there's lots of low-hanging fruit. So, okay, sorry, there's lots of low-hanging fruits to go after to help and facilitate the emergence of larger players. But the problem is that these low-hanging fruits have no political savor. So it's not politically sexy to run an agenda about the single market today and say, okay, we're going to facilitate establishment of small firms cross-border. And so I think that this is a bit of the problem, because it demands a lot of hard work and tedious work, and to locate the bottlenecks. And there's no political reward to do that. It's, you're entering into discussions with member states, and it's complicated. So it's easier to do a big antitrust case against Google and come up with a big fine. It's as simple as that.
Okay, now another question, but in fact of the same spirit. We have seen Netflix for the movies, but Netflix is a newcomer. We may see tomorrow a digital university, but by the way, we are not seeing yet today. In the energy world, we have small digital platforms, but they do not perform much. We have seen Google Nest to control your temperature into your flat, but it does not work. So do we have sectors where big tech is more able to change the world, and do have sectors more difficult? For example, the finance industry, fintech. What do you think of these differences among sectors?
Yeah, I think the entry barriers are very different from one sector to the other. And sometimes also the political connections of the incumbent players are stronger in some sectors than the others. So and maybe big tech has easier capacity to enter these markets than smaller players who face these entry barriers, big time, where big tech has a lot of money and not political capital, but a lot of financial capital to spend in that. But so the absence of big tech players in banking or in healthcare is also a testimony to the existence of quite significant entry barriers in these industries as well. And so, that should put us on the way and think about, okay, maybe there are problems in these markets that we need to deal with as well. Not only the core markets of big tech, but so one area in which you see less barriers to entry, for instance, is the automotive industry. So there is, because this is one area in which you can see that the investments of big tech firms, including non-big tech firms like Tesla, start to change the dynamic. So if you take automotive, you could say, oh, everyone understands that there's going to be a lot of entry and that the game is going to change a lot, right? But if you take banking, you really think that the game is not going to change much. So I mean, that's my hunch. So that should tell you that is an indirect proxy for the entry barriers that exist across industries.
Thank you, Nicolas. Questions from the audience. From François. What is the right geographic level to address these issues? I assume the arms. Given the ease to access websites abroad, how confident would you feel that multiple countries may come with multiple agreements?
Yeah, that's a great question. So as I said before, I think one of the problems for entry and innovation in technology industries has to do with the lack of scale due to structural, cultural, and regulatory problems. And probably the right level is the European level. I want to add as a note that the European Commission's DMA, the Digital Markets Act proposal, as well as the DSA, I think they have this idea in mind, which is that there's been too much at this stage national experimentation with regulation, and that it is time to harmonize what has been done. And so the DMA and DSA make a lot of sense in terms of trying to create a single standard for regulation that would apply European-wide.
Thank you. Now a question from Rudy. I remember the audience that you can ask any question. There is no censorship. Even Donald Trump, if you are hearing us, you can ask your question to Nicolas. But this one is from Rudy. Rudy, regulation normally goes together with law requirements. How could law prescribe what is and what is not allowed in platforms which deal mostly with verbal expression?
Okay, so if I had a constitutional lawyer next to me, he would tell you that one way to do that is to change the law, classify these platforms as something like public squares, and then enforce free speech type rules and principles against the platform when they discriminate, censor, preference types of content over others. That is a normative, the prospective way to address the issue. I think today, today there's no remedy to that. I hope I understand the question right, but if the question is, could Twitter shut President Trump lawfully? The answer is yes. It's a private corporation, just as a newspaper is going to say, I don't want to publish your op-ed, or I don't want to publish your article, I don't like it. It's too right-leaning or it's too left-leaning. Twitter can say, well, I don't like what Mr. Trump tweets, then I decide that it's in breach. And actually they didn't did that only unilaterally. They showed that it was a violation of the terms of service, which are kind of contracts. So I think that's my answer to your question. So today we have to rely on contract law. One thing that we could do is recategorize these platforms as public squares and deal with them as public entities that have to enforce free speech legislation.
Then the next question is again from me. You referred to the new law proposals by European Commission. How would you categorize the attitude of European Commission? Is the law requirement to come from DG Comp, from the extended DG Market and Industry? By the way, is digital to be submitted to digital laws, or is digital also to be submitted to sector laws like automotive, energy, food, etc., etc.? How could you categorize what European Union is doing?
Yes, so I think it's going to be very hard to say that there's something called the digital industry and then the non-digital industry, increasingly so. Companies like, I think John Deere, I heard somewhere someone say tractor as a service, right? You're not buying a tractor, you are actually buying a service. And Tesla might sell you, or Google might sell you a car as a service. You're buying digital, you're not buying a car. So I think the thing about saying there's a digital economy and there's a non-digital economy is bound to evaporate in the future. And so I would be very reluctant to say, oh, we have a very restricted regulation that only applies to digital, because in fact it's going to apply more broadly. I think the relevant concept in the DMA is the concept of a gatekeeper, and that makes it can make sense as a construct. The question is if there's more specification in the DMA, so there is this idea that it's focused on certain sectors like cloud and social networks and certain business models, and maybe there's maneuver for the platforms to change a bit the architecture of their platform and avoid the legislation. One thing that I want to say about the DMA and DSA is I think it's a worthy exercise. One thing that I find a bit strange with the instrument, I understand where it comes from, so I know why it's there, but I have a problem with it. It's trying to do two things at the same time, and they're not compatible necessarily. It's trying to improve what it calls fairness, and it's trying to improve contestability at the same time. Mm. And from an economic standpoint, the best way to improve contestability in principle is to keep profits high but reduce barriers to entry, right? Because then you will have entry. But if you work on fairness, what you're going to do is you're going to try to reduce the profits, which signal margins, which normally incentivize entry. So I'm not sure that you can read the proposal. It's often confused between these two objectives. You can't really you have to really separate what's for contestability and what's for fairness. And sometimes I think it's difficult to read because of that. It would have been clearer to
we have only 20 seconds, Nicolas.
Yes.
And a new question from François. Why do we focus only on American big tech And why don't we address the Chinese big tech, Alibaba, Tencent, WeChat, etc.? 20 seconds.
Oh, they do much less work in Europe. And so that's one. And so, well, they're less of a concern. And two, we know very little about them. And three, I think that Europe has been mostly observing the trade war and what to do with China. So following, but very carefully. Maybe with the Biden administration, we'll have clearer signs of what we should do.
Ladies, gentlemen, I did enjoy it too much. I would like to thank Nicolas. They are very important questions, but you see, answers are difficult to fully formulate. Of course, I will do what I was telling, to applaud Nicolas. I am happy because Nicolas is working in the same university like me, and we will have occasion to speak at the canteen while having these norms at our canteen, 2 meters between Nicolas and I. And again, many thanks to the digital fairy, Chiara Canestrini. Alleluia, alleluia. I hope that in spring or summer, we will be able to meet all of us and to hug and to cheer. And it will be a wonderful return to normality. Goodbye to all of you.